The saloon doors swung open with a crack that silenced every conversation in the smoke-filled room, and Delilah Jensen felt her stomach drop as her father stumbled inside, his face red with whiskey and desperation. She had been serving drinks to miners and cattlemen for the past 4 hours, her feet aching in worn leather boots, but the look in Walter Jensen's bloodshot eyes told her this night was about to get much worse. He weaved through the tables, knocking into chairs, until he stood in the center of the room and raised his voice loud enough to rattle the bottles behind the bar. "I need a man with money," her father announced, his words slurring together. "Any man willing to pay off my debt can have my daughter here. She is 22 years old, healthy, and can cook and clean. $500 and she is yours." The blood drained from Delilah's face as every pair of eyes in the saloon turned toward her. The tin tray she had been holding slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, spilling whiskey across the dusty wooden planks. It was October of 1878 in Raton, New Mexico, a rough town nestled in the shadows of the Rocky Mountains where the railroad had brought both prosperity and vice. Her father had always been a gambling man, but she never imagined he would sink this low. "Pa, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden murmur of interested men. "Shut your mouth, girl," Walter snapped, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. "You will do as I say. I owe Garrett $500 by tomorrow, or he will put a bullet in my head. You are my only asset worth anything." Tears burned in Delilah's hazel eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had watched her mother die of fever 3 years ago, had kept house for her worthless father ever since, and this was how he repaid her devotion. Around the room, men were already leaning forward in their seats, their eyes crawling over her slender frame and the dark brown hair she kept tied back in a simple braid. She felt like livestock at an auction. "I will take her." The voice came from the back corner, deep and steady as thunder rolling across the plains. Every head turned to see who had spoken. A massive figure unfolded from the shadows, rising to his full height of well over 6 feet. The man who stepped into the lamplight was unlike anyone Delilah had ever seen in Raton. He wore buckskin pants and a thick leather vest over a worn cotton shirt, his shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the narrow space between tables. Dark hair fell past his collar, and a thick beard covered his jaw. His arms were corded with muscle, visible even through his clothing, and his hands looked strong enough to snap a man's neck without effort. But it was his eyes that held Delilah's attention, a striking blue-gray that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "You got $500? Walter demanded, squinting at the stranger. The mountain man reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a thick roll of bills. He counted them with surprising delicacy for such large hands, then held up the money for everyone to see. $500, right here." Delilah's father lurched forward, reaching for the cash, but the stranger pulled it back. "Not so fast. I want to be clear about the terms. I pay your debt, and your daughter comes with me. But she comes of her own free will, not as property." "What the hell does that mean?" Walter sputtered. "I am selling her to you. You own her." The mountain man's jaw tightened, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "I do not buy people. I will pay your debt because no daughter should suffer for her father's sins. But the girl decides whether she wants to come with me or stay here in this town. Her choice." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. This was not how these transactions usually worked. Delilah stared at the stranger, trying to understand what game he was playing. "Was this some kind of trick?" "That is the stupidest thing I ever heard," Walter said, but his eyes were still fixed on the money. "Fine, whatever. Give me the cash and you can ask her whatever fool questions you want." "We do this proper," the mountain man said. He turned to the bartender, a grizzled man named Silas who had seen everything in his 30 years of pouring drinks. "You know Garrett McCrae?" "Everyone knows Garrett," Silas confirmed. "Send someone to fetch him. I will pay the debt directly, with witnesses. I want no confusion about this." Walter looked like he wanted to argue, but the stranger's tone left no room for negotiation. Silas sent the youngest server running out into the night, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the saloon. The mountain man did not sit back down. He stood with his arms crossed, waiting, while Delilah's father paced and muttered to himself. Delilah remained frozen near the bar, her mind racing. She could try to run, but where would she go? She had no money, No family except her worthless father, and no skills beyond serving drinks and keeping house. Rattan was not kind to women on their own. 15 minutes later, Garrett McCrae pushed through the saloon doors with two armed men flanking him. Garrett was a loan shark and part-time criminal, a thin man with cold eyes and a reputation for violence. He took one look at Walter Jensen and smiled without warmth. "Walter, I was just thinking about you. Tomorrow is your deadline." "I got your money," Walter said quickly, pointing at the stranger. "This man is paying my debt." Garrett's gaze shifted to the mountain man and his smile faded. "I do not know you. Name is Josiah Walker. I have been trapping in the mountains north of here for the past 5 years. I came down to sell furs and buy supplies." Josiah held up the roll of bills again. $500. "That is what Jensen owes you." "It is," Garrett confirmed slowly. "What is your interest in this?" "That is my business. Do you want the money or not?" Garrett studied Josiah for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of trap. Finally, he held out his hand. "Cash first." Josiah counted out $500 while everyone in the saloon watched in rapt attention. Garrett took the money, counted it again himself, then nodded. "Jensen's debt is paid. We are square." He looked at Walter with contempt. "You are a lucky son of a bitch. If I ever see you at my card table again, I will shoot you on principle." Walter nodded frantically, already edging toward the door. But Josiah's voice stopped him. "Hold on, you are not going anywhere yet." The mountain man turned to face Delilah, and the room seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the scar that ran along his left forearm, the way he held himself with the coiled readiness of a predator. He was probably in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen hard times. "What is your name?" he asked her gently. "Delilah." "Delilah Jensen." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Delilah, that is a good name." Josiah glanced around at the watching crowd, then back at her. "I know this is not how any woman should be treated, and I am sorry you were put in this position. But here is the truth, as plain as I can make it. I paid your father's debt, which means he is free to crawl back into whatever hole he crawled out of. Though you have a choice to make." "What choice?" she whispered. "You can stay here in Rattan. I will give you $50 to get you started. Enough for a room and food while you figure out what you want to do. Or you can come with me back to my cabin in the mountains. I have a good place up there, warm and dry with plenty of food. I am not going to lie and say it is an easy life, but it is honest work and clean air. You would have your own space, and I would not lay a hand on you unless you wanted me to." He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his hard features. "I live alone up there, have for years. It gets lonely sometimes. I could use the company, and you look like you could use a fresh start." Delilah's mind whirled. This man was offering her freedom, or at least something close to it. But could she trust him? He had just paid $500 for her, whether he called it that or not. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Josiah's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. "My sister was sold by our stepfather when she was 19. Sold to a man who beat her so bad she died 6 months later. I was working a claim in California at the time. Did not even know it had happened until I came home and found her buried. I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to stop it from happening to someone else, I would." His blue-gray eyes held hers. "I cannot change what your father tried to do tonight, but I can give you a choice. That is all any person deserves." The sincerity in his voice cut through Delilah's fear. She looked over at her father, who was watching this exchange with obvious impatience, and felt something inside her harden. Walter Jensen had given up any claim to her loyalty the moment he offered her like a poker chip. She had spent 3 years caring for him, cooking his meals, washing his clothes, and trying to keep him from drinking away every cent they had. She owed him nothing. "If I go with you," she said carefully, "and I do not like it, can I leave? I will bring you back to Rattan myself," Josiah promised. "Or anywhere else you want to go within reason. You will not be my prisoner, Delilah. You will be my guest, unless you decide you want to be something more." Heat crept up her neck at the implication, but there was no leer in his expression, just honest intention. She took a deep breath and made her decision. "I will go with you." Relief washed over Josiah's face, though he tried to hide it. "I am sure." There is nothing for me here anymore. She turned to her father one last time. I hope the guilt eats you alive, Pa. I hope every time you close your eyes, you see Ma's face and remember that she died thinking you were a good man. Walter flinched as if she had struck him, but he said nothing. He simply turned and stumbled out of the saloon, leaving Delilah behind without so much as a goodbye. The other patrons slowly returned to their drinks and card games, the entertainment over. Garrett and his men left shortly after, and Delilah found herself standing alone with the mountain man who had just changed her entire life. "Do you have belongings?" Josiah asked. "Things you need to collect. Just a few clothes and my mother's Bible. They are in a room upstairs. Go get them. I will wait here." Delilah hurried up the narrow staircase to the tiny room she had been renting above the saloon. Her hands shook as she stuffed her few possessions into a canvas bag: 3 dresses, a nightgown, a brush, some undergarments, and the leather-bound Bible that was the only thing of value her mother had owned. The room looked even more depressing now that she was leaving it, with its single window overlooking the muddy street and the thin mattress that barely kept out the cold. She had lived here for 3 years and would not miss it for a moment. When she came back downstairs, Josiah was talking quietly with Silas. The bartender nodded, then went to the cash box and counted out some coins. "That is what she is owed for tonight," Silas explained, handing the money to Delilah. "Plus a little extra. You are a good worker, girl. I am sorry about your father." "Thank you, Silas." Delilah tucked the coins into her pocket, touched by the unexpected kindness. Josiah led her outside into the cool October night. The street was busy with the usual evening traffic: drunks and gamblers, and working girls calling out to passing men. Delilah had always hated this part of town, the way it felt dangerous and unpredictable after dark. She followed Josiah to a hitching post where 2 horses waited patiently. One was a huge bay gelding that looked strong enough to carry a buffalo, and the other was a pretty gray mare with kind eyes. "This is Thunder," Josiah said, patting the bay's thick neck, "and this is Willow. She's more gentle. You can ride her." "I have not ridden much," Delilah admitted. "My father sold our horses years ago. Willow will take care of you. She knows the trail." Josiah secured her bag to the saddle, then held out his hand to help her mount. His grip was warm and steady, and he lifted her into the saddle as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Once she was seated, he showed her how to hold the reins and where to put her feet in the stirrups. "How far is your cabin?" she asked as he swung onto Thunder's back with fluid grace. "About 4 hours north. We will be there before dawn." He nudged his horse forward, and Willow followed automatically, her gait smooth and even. They rode through Rayton and out onto the open trail, leaving the lights of town behind. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape of rolling hills and scrub brush. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose like dark sentinels against the star-scattered sky. Delilah had lived her whole life in this territory, but had never ventured far from Rayton. The vastness of the wilderness both thrilled and terrified her. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Delilah kept stealing glances at Josiah, trying to understand the man who had so casually upended her existence. He sat his horse like he was born in the saddle, his body moving with Thunder's rhythm, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness for threats. Everything about him spoke of competence and strength, from the rifle strapped to his saddle to the knife at his belt. He was the kind of man who could survive anywhere, she realized, the kind of man who did not need anyone. So why had he saved her? "Can I ask you something?" she finally ventured. "Of course. You said you live alone. Have you always been by yourself up there?" Josiah was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. "Mostly. I spent years working claims and hunting, moving from place to place. After my sister died, I did not much feel like being around people. I found that cabin about 5 years back, fixed it up, and decided to stay. I trap beaver and mink, cure the furs, then bring them down to Rackington or Santa Fe to sell. It is simple work, but it suits me. Does not it get lonely?" "Yes," he admitted. "Especially in winter when the snow gets so deep you cannot go anywhere for weeks at a time. I have my horses and a good dog named Bear who keeps me company, but it is not the same as having someone to talk to, someone to share meals with." He glanced over at her, and even in the moonlight, she could see the sincerity in his expression. "I am not expecting anything from you, Delilah. I want you to know that. If all you want is a safe place to stay while you figure out your next step, that is fine by me. And if I want more?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. She immediately felt her cheeks burn. Josiah smiled, a real smile that transformed his stern face into something almost boyish. "Then we will figure that out together. But there is no rush. We have all the time in the world." They continued riding, and Delilah found herself relaxing into Willow's gentle gait. The night air was cold but not unbearable, and the sounds of the wilderness surrounded them. Crickets chirping, an owl hooting in the distance, the soft rustle of small animals in the brush. It was so different from the noise and chaos of Raton. Out here, under the vast expanse of stars, she felt like she could finally breathe. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the landscape changed. Pine trees replaced scrub brush, and the air grew thinner and colder. Josiah pulled a thick wool blanket from his pack and draped it around Delilah's shoulders without a word. The gesture was so thoughtful, so considerate, that she felt tears prick her eyes again. When was the last time someone had taken care of her? Her mother, probably, years ago before the fever took her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You are welcome." They rode on, climbing steadily. Delilah's legs were starting to ache from the unfamiliar position, but she did not complain. This discomfort was nothing compared to the humiliation and fear she had felt in that saloon, watching men eye her like a piece of meat. Josiah had saved her from that. He had given her a way out when she had none. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they crested a ridge and Delilah saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, built from thick logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. Smoke curled from the chimney, which seemed strange until a large black and brown dog came bounding out of the trees, barking happily. "That is Bear," Josiah said with clear affection. "He must have heard us coming." The dog ran circles around Thunder and Willow, his tail wagging furiously. He was massive, probably part wolf, with intelligent amber eyes and a thick coat. When they dismounted, Bear immediately rushed to Josiah, who knelt down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "I know, boy. I missed you too. But we have a guest, so you need to be on your best behavior." Josiah stood and gestured toward the cabin. "Come on, let me show you around." The inside of the cabin was surprisingly cozy. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a low fire burning steadily. There was a simple kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, shelves stocked with supplies, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A bed took up one corner, piled with furs and blankets, and there was another smaller sleeping area separated by a hanging blanket. Pelts hung from the rafters, curing in the dry air, and various tools and traps lined the walls. "It is not much," Josiah said, suddenly seeming self-conscious, "but it is home. It is wonderful," Delilah said honestly. The cabin was clean and well organized, a far cry from the squalid room she had been living in. "You built all this yourself?" "The cabin was already here when I found it, but I reinforced the walls, added the second sleeping area, and rebuilt the chimney. I have been working on it bit by bit." He pointed to the curtained-off section. "That can be your space. It has a good mattress stuffed with pine needles and enough blankets to keep you warm. I sleep out here by the fire." Delilah walked over and pulled back the curtain. The sleeping area was small but private, with a narrow bed, a trunk for storage, and even a small mirror hanging on the wall. It was more than she had expected. "This is perfect," she said. "Thank you, Josiah." He smiled again. That same transformation of his hard features into something gentle. "You must be exhausted. Why do not you get some rest? I need to tend to the horses and check my traps, but I will be back in a few hours to make breakfast." "I can cook," Delilah offered. "If you want. We will take turns. Today you rest. Tomorrow we will figure out a routine." He grabbed his rifle and headed for the door, Bear trotting at his heels. "Make yourself at home, Delilah. Everything here is yours to use." After he left, Delilah stood in the quiet cabin for a long moment, trying to absorb everything that had happened in the last few hours. She had gone from being sold like property to standing in a mountain cabin with a man who asked nothing of her except her company. It felt surreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment, but the rough wood beneath her fingers felt real. The warmth from the fire felt real, and the sense of possibility blooming in her chest felt real too. She unpacked her few belongings, storing them in the trunk, then crawled into the bed. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, and the blankets smelled of pine and fresh air. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into the deepest sleep she had experienced in years. When Delilah woke, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's small windows, and the smell of cooking bacon filled the air. She sat up, disoriented for a moment. Before remembering where she was, she could hear Josiah moving around in the main room, the soft clink of pots and pans. Bear woofed softly, probably begging for scraps. She quickly changed from her saloon dress into a simpler calico work dress, ran a brush through her tangled hair, and emerged from behind the curtain. Josiah was at the stove, expertly flipping bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He had cleaned up since she last saw him, his face freshly shaved to reveal a strong jaw, and his dark hair was pulled back in a leather tie. Without the full beard, she could see more of his features: high cheekbones, a straight nose, and that generous mouth that seemed to smile easily when he was relaxed. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her. "I hope the noise did not wake you." "Not at all. I slept better than I have in months." She moved closer, watching him work. "What can I do to help? There are eggs in that basket if you want to scramble them. And coffee is hot if you want a cup." They worked side by side in comfortable silence, preparing the meal. Delilah found herself sneaking glances at Josiah, noticing details she had missed in the dim light of the saloon, the way his muscles flexed as he moved, the casual competence with which he handled everything, the gentle way he tossed scraps to Bear. He was nothing like the rough, violent men she had known in Raton. There was a gentleness to him that contradicted his imposing size. They ate at the small table, and the food was simple but delicious. Real bacon, fresh eggs, thick slices of bread toasted over the fire. Delilah could not remember the last time she had eaten so well. "This is wonderful," she said. "Wait until you try my venison stew. That is my specialty." Josiah leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee cup. "So tell me about yourself, Delilah. What did you do before you were working in that saloon?" She hesitated, not sure how much to share. But his expression was open and genuinely curious, so she took a chance. "I grew up on a small farm outside Raton. My mother raised chickens and grew vegetables, and my father worked as a blacksmith. We were not rich, but we had enough. Then my mother got sick, and everything fell apart. Pa started drinking and gambling, trying to escape his grief. He lost the farm, lost his job, and we ended up in town with nothing. I took work at the saloon just to keep us fed, but it was never enough. He gambled away every cent I made." "That must have been hard," Josiah said quietly. "It was, but I kept thinking that maybe he would get better, that maybe the father I remembered from childhood would come back." She laughed bitterly. "Last night proved how foolish that hope was. It was not foolish to love your father. It was not foolish to hope he would do right by you. He is the one who failed, not you." The kindness in Josiah's words made her throat tight. "How do you know about these things? About what it feels like? I told you about my sister, but I did not tell you about my mother. She married my stepfather after my real father died, and he was a cruel man. Beat her regularly. Beat me too when I got big enough to try and stop him. I left home at 16 to work the gold fields, sent money back when I could, but it was never enough to get them free of him. When I finally came back and learned what he had done to my sister, I almost killed him. Probably would have if the sheriff had not intervened." Josiah's jaw tightened and his eyes went distant. "I learned then that some people cannot be saved. They have to want to change, and most of them never do." "What happened to your stepfather?" "He died a few years later, shot in a card game dispute. My mother passed shortly after, heartbroken and worn out, and I came here, looking for peace." He refocused on her, and the intensity in his gaze made her heart skip. "But peace is lonely, Delilah. I did not realize how lonely until I saw you in that saloon, and I knew I had to do something." "I am glad you did," she said softly. "Whatever happens next, I am grateful you gave me a choice." They spent the rest of the day settling into a routine. Josiah showed her around the property, the smokehouse where he cured meat, the small barn where Thunder and Willow stayed at night, the creek where he got fresh water. He explained his trapping schedule and the various chores that needed doing. Delilah absorbed it all eagerly, happy to have purpose and direction again. As the days turned into weeks, they fell into an easy rhythm. Josiah would check his trap lines in the mornings while Delilah tended the cabin, cooked meals, and worked on small projects like mending clothes or organizing supplies. In the afternoons, he would process pelts or chop firewood, and she would help where she could. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Josiah was surprisingly well read for a mountain man, with shelves of books he had collected over the years. They read together sometimes, taking turns with passages from classics or adventure novels. It was during these quiet evenings that Delilah began to fall in love with him, not just because he had saved her or because he was kind, but because of who he was as a person. He was patient when teaching her new skills, never condescending or dismissive. He listened when she talked, really listened, asking thoughtful questions and remembering small details she mentioned. He made her laugh with dry observations about the world, and he shared his own vulnerabilities without shame. And he was so careful with her, always respectful of her space and boundaries. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel like she owed him anything. But she could see the way he looked at her, sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, a longing in his eyes that made her breath catch. One evening in late November, as the first real snow began to fall outside, Delilah made a decision. They were sitting by the fire as usual, bare sprawled at their feet. Josiah was reading aloud from a book of poetry, his deep voice turning the words into music. When he finished the passage, she reached over and gently took the book from his hands. "Josiah," she said, her heart pounding, "can I tell you something?" He turned to face her fully, concern flickering across his features. "Of course, anything. I know I have only been here for 6 weeks, but I need you to know that I am happy. Happier than I have been in years, maybe ever, and it is because of you." She took a shaky breath. "You have been so good to me, so patient and kind. You have never asked me for anything, never made me feel like I was a burden. But I want you to know that if you want more, if you want us to be more than just housemates, I want that too." Josiah's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. "Delilah, are you sure? I do not want you to feel obligated." "I am not obligated. I am choosing this. I am choosing you." She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin. "I love you, Josiah Walker. I think I have loved you since that first night when you gave me a choice." He stared at her for a heartbeat, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her tight against his broad chest. She could feel his heart hammering beneath her cheek, as wild as her own. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God, Delilah, I have loved you since the moment I saw you in that saloon. I was coming down for supplies, nothing more. And then I walked into that place and saw your father trying to sell you, and something in me just snapped. I knew I had to help you, but I never imagined you would come to care for me the way I care for you." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and what she saw in his face took her breath away: love, desire, hope, and a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. "Kiss me," she whispered. Josiah cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks, and then he kissed her with a gentleness that made her melt. His lips were warm and soft, and he kissed her like she was something precious, something worth savoring. Delilah had been kissed before by clumsy cowboys and drunken miners, but nothing had prepared her for this, the feeling of being cherished, of being loved. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Josiah rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to marry you, Delilah. Not because of some debt or obligation, but because I cannot imagine my life without you now. Will you marry me?" Joy burst through her like sunlight. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally settled back by the fire, Delilah was tucked against Josiah's side, his arm around her shoulders. She felt safe and loved and hopeful for the first time since her mother died. Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing the world in white, but inside the cabin, everything was warm and perfect. The next morning, they made plans to ride down to Rayton so they could be married properly. Josiah wanted to do everything according to the law, to make sure no one could ever question their union. They would need a preacher or a judge, witnesses, and official documents. It would take a few days to arrange everything, but Josiah was determined to make it happen before winter set in completely and the mountain passes became impassable. They left 2 days later, taking both horses and traveling slowly through the snow-dusted landscape. Delilah felt strange returning to Rattan after nearly 2 months away, like she was a different person than the frightened girl who had left. When they rode down the main street, heads turned. People recognized her, and she could see the questions in their eyes. But Josiah rode beside her like a protective wall, and no one dared approach. They went straight to the church where they found Pastor Matthews, an elderly man who had known Delilah's mother. When they explained their situation, he agreed to marry them that very afternoon. Josiah went to the general store to buy a simple gold ring while Delilah spoke with the pastor, and by the time the sun was beginning to set, they were standing before the altar with Silas the bartender and his wife as witnesses. Pastor Matthews read from his worn Bible, speaking about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Delilah barely heard the words. She was too focused on Josiah, on the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. When it came time for vows, his voice was steady and sure. I, Josiah Walker, take you, Delilah Jensen, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and honor you for all the days of my life. You are my partner, my best friend, and the answer to prayers I did not even know I was praying. I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you. Tears streamed down Delilah's face as she spoke her own vows. I, Delilah Jensen, take you, Josiah Walker, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, support you, and stand beside you through everything life brings. You saved me when I had lost all hope, and I will spend the rest of my life showing you what that means to me. I love you with my whole heart. When Pastor Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Josiah kissed her with all the pent-up passion and love he had been holding back, and Delilah kissed him back with equal fervor. They were married. They were a family. Silas insisted on buying them dinner at a proper restaurant to celebrate, and they spent a pleasant evening eating good food and talking about their plans for the future. When someone mentioned Walter Jensen, Silas shook his head grimly. He left town about 3 weeks ago. Heard he was heading to Colorado to try his luck at the silver mines. Good riddance, I say. Delilah felt a pang at the news, but it was not grief, it was relief. Her father had made his choices, and now she was free to make hers. She reached under the table and squeezed Josiah's hand, and he squeezed back, understanding without words. They spent that night at a boarding house, and for the first time, they shared a bed as husband and wife. Josiah was tender and patient, taking his time to make sure Delilah felt safe and loved. When they finally came together, it was with a passion and connection that left them both breathless. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Josiah tracing lazy patterns on her back while she rested her head on his chest. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "I have never been happier," she answered honestly. "Today was perfect. Every day with you will be perfect," he promised, and she believed him. They returned to the cabin the next morning, eager to start their married life. Winter descended in earnest over the next few weeks, bringing deep snow and bitter cold, but inside the cabin everything was warm and cozy. Delilah took over most of the cooking and household tasks, finding satisfaction in caring for their home. Josiah checked his trap lines when the weather allowed and spent the worst days inside, working on projects or reading with his wife curled up beside him. They made love often, discovering each other's bodies and learning what brought pleasure. Delilah had been nervous at first, her only knowledge of intimacy coming from overheard conversations and crude jokes. But Josiah was a generous lover, more concerned with her enjoyment than his own. He worshipped her body like it was a temple, and she learned to respond with equal passion, finding a freedom in their lovemaking that she had never imagined possible. As winter gave way to spring, their bond only deepened. They worked together to plant a garden, tilling the soil and planting seeds for vegetables that would feed them through the next winter. Josiah taught Delilah how to tan hides and preserve meat, skills that would serve her well as a mountain wife. She taught him songs her mother had sung, filling the cabin with music for the first time in years. One warm afternoon in May, as they were working in the garden together, Delilah realized her monthly courses were late, very late. She had been feeling tired lately, with occasional nausea in the mornings, but she had attributed it to the hard work of mountain life. Now, counting back the weeks, she felt her heart begin to race. "Josiah," she said slowly, straightening up from where she had been weeding, "I think I might be pregnant." He froze in the middle of turning soil, his eyes snapping to hers. Are you sure? Not completely sure, but I am 6 weeks late, and I have been feeling strange, tired and sick sometimes. She pressed a hand to her still flat stomach. I think we are going to have a baby. Josiah dropped his shovel and crossed to her in 3 long strides, sweeping her up in his arms and spinning her around. His laugh was pure joy, and when he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears. A baby, he breathed. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? She asked, though she could see the answer on his face. Happy does not even begin to cover it. You have given me everything, Delilah. A home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning. I love you so much. They held each other in the garden, surrounded by new growth and possibility, and Delilah felt her own joy overflow. She was going to be a mother. They were going to raise a child together in this beautiful, wild place. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Josiah became even more protective, insisting she rest more and take on fewer physical tasks. He rode down to Raton and brought back supplies, including several books on childbirth and infant care. He read them cover to cover, determined to be prepared for anything. Delilah bloomed as her belly grew, her face glowing with health and happiness. She sewed baby clothes from soft fabric Josiah bought, embroidering tiny flowers and animals on the little gowns. They talked endlessly about names, what kind of parents they wanted to be, what they hoped for their child's future. Boy or girl, it does not matter to me, Josiah said one evening as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her swollen stomach, as long as the baby is healthy and you are safe. I think it is a boy, Delilah said. He kicks like a mule. As if on cue, the baby kicked against Josiah's palm, and his face lit up with wonder. Strong like his mother. Strong like his father, she corrected, covering his hand with hers. As her due date approached in late autumn, Josiah grew increasingly nervous. There was no doctor nearby, and while he had helped birth foals and calves, a human baby was different. He convinced Delilah to let him bring a midwife up from Raton, an experienced woman named Mrs. Hernandez, who agreed to stay at the cabin for the last few weeks of the pregnancy. Mrs. Hernandez was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with warm brown eyes and capable hands. She pronounced Delilah healthy and the baby positioned correctly, which eased some of Josiah's anxiety. She also shared stories of her own 8 children, making Delilah laugh and feel less afraid. The baby came on a cold November night, almost exactly 1 year after Delilah had first arrived at the cabin. Her labor started just after sunset, and Josiah nearly wore a hole in the floor with his pacing while Mrs. Hernandez attended to Delilah. Every cry of pain from his wife made him flinch, and he wanted desperately to help but felt utterly useless. Finally, after hours that felt like days, Mrs. Hernandez called him in. "Come meet your son," she said with a tired smile. Josiah stumbled into the sleeping area to find Delilah propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. When she looked up at him, her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Our son," she said softly. "Come see him." Josiah knelt beside the bed, his hands trembling as he looked down at the baby. He was so small, with a fuzzy cap of dark hair and a scrunched-up red face. As if sensing his father's presence, the baby opened his eyes, blue-gray, just like Josiah's. "He is perfect," Josiah whispered, reaching out to stroke one impossibly tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his thick index finger, and something in Josiah's chest cracked open. "You did so well, Delilah. I am so proud of you." "We did well," she corrected. "We made him together. What should we call him?" They had discussed names, but now, looking at their son, Josiah knew exactly what felt right. "James, after your mother's father, James Matthew Walker." Tears filled Delilah's eyes. "That is perfect. Hello, James. Welcome to the world." They spent the rest of the night marveling over their son, counting his tiny fingers and toes, laughing softly when he yawned or made little noises. Mrs. Hernandez showed Delilah how to nurse, and once the baby was fed and sleeping, she pronounced them a natural family and retired to the main room to sleep. Alone with his wife and son, Josiah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of his love. A year ago, he had been alone in this cabin, convinced he would die a solitary old man. Now he had a wife he adored and a son to raise. His life had meaning and purpose beyond simple survival. "Thank you," he said to Delilah, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to come here. Thank you for taking a chance on me." You saved me first, she reminded him. You gave me a choice when no one else would. You showed me what love really looks like. I should be thanking you. Then we are even. He kissed her softly, mindful of her exhaustion. Get some rest. I will watch over both of you. The first few months of parenthood were exhausting but wonderful. James was a healthy baby with a strong set of lungs, and he kept them up at all hours with his needs. But Josiah took to fatherhood like he had been born for it, changing diapers and walking the floor with a crying baby while Delilah rested. He sang old songs in his rumbling voice, and James would quiet, staring up at his father with wide eyes. As winter settled in again, they became a tight family unit. Delilah would nurse James by the fire while Josiah worked on pelts, and they would talk about their dreams for the future. They wanted more children, maybe a daughter next time. They talked about expanding the cabin, adding more rooms as their family grew. They discussed teaching James to hunt and trap, to read and write, to be a good man like his father. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and birdsong, and James began to change rapidly. He smiled and laughed, reaching for his parents with chubby hands. Josiah built a wooden cradle that rocked gently, carved with intricate designs of mountains and trees. Delilah sewed more clothes as James grew, and she started a journal documenting his milestones. By the time James was a year old, he was taking his first wobbly steps. Josiah and Delilah sat on the cabin floor, encouraging him to walk from one to the other, laughing with delight when he succeeded. Bear watched with the patience of a saint as James used him as a climbing structure, the big dog's tail wagging even when tiny hands pulled his fur. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Josiah's trapping business was doing well, bringing in steady income that he saved carefully for their future. Delilah's garden flourished, providing vegetables that she preserved for winter. They added chickens for eggs and fresh meat, and Josiah built a stronger barn for the horses. The cabin itself expanded as he added a proper bedroom for themselves and kept the original sleeping area for James. 2 years after James was born, Delilah became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and she carried the baby with grace and confidence. Josiah was still protective but less frantic, trusting in his wife's strength and Mrs. Hernandez's expertise. Their daughter was born on a beautiful spring morning, her arrival so quick and easy that Mrs. Hernandez barely had time to prepare. She came into the world with a lusty cry and a full head of brown hair like her mother's. They named her Grace, after the grace that had brought Josiah and Delilah together in the first place. James was fascinated by his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to bath time. He would sing to her in his high toddler voice, copying the songs his father sang, and Grace would watch him with serious dark eyes. Delilah and Josiah watched their children together, marveling at how their family had grown. The years continued to pass in a blur of happiness and hard work. They had another son, Daniel, 2 years after Grace, and then one more daughter, Emma, completing their family. The cabin expanded again and again to accommodate everyone, until it was more of a homestead than a simple mountain dwelling. Josiah hired help during busy seasons, young men from Raton who wanted to learn trapping, and the extra income allowed them to build a proper schoolhouse where Delilah taught all 4 children to read, write, and do mathematics. Through it all, Josiah and Delilah's love only deepened. They still made time for each other, despite the demands of 4 children and a growing business. They would steal moments alone, a walk by the creek at sunset, a quiet cup of coffee before the children woke, passionate encounters after everyone had gone to bed. They never took each other for granted, always remembering how they had found each other against impossible odds. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Josiah surprised Delilah with a day trip down to Raton. They left the children with Mrs. Hernandez, who had become like a grandmother to them all, and spent the day exploring the town that had changed so much. The saloon where they first met had burned down years ago, replaced by a bank. The rough edges of frontier life had been smoothed by civilization, with proper schools and churches and even a library. They had dinner at the best restaurant in town, and Josiah gave Delilah a delicate silver necklace he had commissioned from a jeweler. It had a small locket with space for 4 tiny photographs of their children. "It is beautiful," Delilah breathed, touching the locket with reverent fingers. "Josiah, you did not have to do this. I wanted to." I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you have done for me, for our family. You have made my life worth living, Delilah. Every single day with you is a gift." She reached across the table and took his hand, her eyes shining. "I love you so much. Sometimes I think about that night 10 years ago, how scared I was, how hopeless everything seemed. And then you walked out of the shadows and changed everything. You gave me a life I never could have imagined." "We gave each other that life," Josiah corrected. "You could have chosen to stay in Rattan, to make your own way. But you took a chance on a strange mountain man who offered you nothing but a cabin in the woods. That took courage. It took love," she said. "Even then, I think part of me loved you. I just did not know it yet." They finished their dinner and walked through town hand in hand, watching the gas streetlights flicker on as dusk fell. It was strange to be away from their children, their home, but also wonderful to remember what it was just the two of them. They talked about their dreams that had come true and new dreams they wanted to chase. Maybe they would travel someday, show their children the world beyond the mountains. Maybe they would expand their homestead even more, create a legacy that would last generations. When they returned home the next morning, their children rushed to greet them, everyone talking at once about what they had done while their parents were gone. James, now 10 years old, had caught his first rabbit in a trap his father had taught him to set. Grace, 8, had baked bread all by herself with Mrs. Hernandez's guidance. Daniel, 6, and Emma, 4, had found a family of foxes living near the creek and wanted to know if they could keep them as pets. Josiah scooped up Emma while Delilah hugged the older children, and they all went inside together, the cabin filled with laughter and love. This was what mattered, Josiah thought. Not money or fame or adventure. Just this, a family that loved each other, a home filled with warmth, and a wife who made every day worth living. As the years continued to march forward, their children grew into remarkable young people. James inherited his father's size and strength, becoming a skilled trapper and hunter who helped run the family business. Grace was brilliant and artistic, filling the cabin with drawings and paintings of the mountain landscape. Daniel was quiet and thoughtful, drawn to books and learning. Emma was pure sunshine, always laughing and making everyone around her smile. Josiah and Delilah watched their children grow with pride and no small amount of bittersweetness. Time moved so quickly, each season bleeding into the next, but they faced it together, just as they had faced everything since that fateful night in Rattan. One evening, when the children were all grown and starting to make their own ways in the world, Josiah and Delilah sat on the porch they had built years ago, watching the sun set over the mountains. James had married a sweet girl from Rattan and was building his own cabin nearby. Grace had gone to Santa Fe to study art. Daniel was working as a teacher in town, and Emma was courting a young man who made her eyes light up. "We did well," Delilah said softly, leaning against Josiah's broad shoulder. They were both older now, gray threading through their hair, lines on their faces earned by years of laughter and hard work, but they were still strong, still healthy, still deeply in love. "We did," Josiah agreed, his arm around her shoulders. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. Do you ever think about that night, when you walked into that saloon and found me?" "All the time. It was the most important moment of my life. Well, that and the day you agreed to marry me, and every day our children were born." He kissed the top of her head. "Actually, every day with you has been the most important day." She laughed, that same musical sound that had captivated him all those years ago. "You are getting sentimental in your old age. Can you blame me? I am married to the most beautiful, amazing woman in the world. I am allowed to be sentimental." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Bear had passed away years ago, but they had a new dog named Cedar who dozed at their feet. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, and Delilah felt a deep sense of peace. This was her life, not the one she had been born into or the one her father had tried to force on her, but the one she had chosen. The one she had built with Josiah through love and hard work and unwavering commitment. "What do you think happens next?" she asked. "Now that the children are grown and starting their own lives, I think we get to focus on us again," Josiah said. "We can take that trip we have always talked about. See San Francisco or Denver. Or we can just stay right here and enjoy the quiet. As long as I am with you, I do not care what we do. Right here sounds perfect, Delilah decided. This is our home, our life. I would not want to be anywhere else. Me neither. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and even then they lingered, reluctant to let the moment end. In the morning there would be work to do. There was always work to do. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life worth living. Years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren who filled the cabin with noise and energy. Josiah taught his grandsons to trap and track, just as he had taught James. Delilah taught her granddaughters to sew and cook and showed them all how to read. Their legacy was not just in the land they had cultivated or the business they had built, but in the family they had created, a family founded on love and choice and second chances. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the homestead for a celebration. All four of their children were there with their spouses and children, along with friends from Rayton and the surrounding mountains. Mrs. Hernandez, now quite elderly but still spry, brought her famous tamales. There was music and dancing and so much laughter that the mountains seemed to echo with it. At one point, James stood up to make a toast. He had grown into a man who looked remarkably like his father, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same striking eyes. "I want to thank my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "not just for raising us or providing for us, but for showing us what real love looks like. My father saved my mother from a terrible situation, but she saved him right back from a lonely life. They built this family on respect and partnership and a love that never quit. That is the example they set for all of us, and it is one I hope to live up to." Delilah felt tears streaming down her face as everyone raised their glasses. Josiah pulled her close, and she could feel his heart beating strong and steady against her side. They had done it. They had taken a moment of darkness and desperation and turned it into a legacy of love that would last for generations. "Thank you," she whispered to him, "for everything. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life. Thank you for choosing me," he whispered back, "for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who had nothing to offer but his heart. Your heart was all I ever needed." They kissed, and their children cheered, and the celebration continued long into the night. As Delilah looked around at the faces she loved most in the world, she felt overwhelming gratitude. Her life could have gone so differently. She could have ended up with a cruel man who bought her like property. She could have stayed in Rayton, struggling to survive alone. She could have given up hope entirely. But she had been given a choice, and she had chosen love. She had chosen Josiah. And that choice had made all the difference. The party eventually wound down, and guests began heading home. Their children and grandchildren stayed to help clean up, working together in the easy way of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. When everyone had finally gone to bed, Josiah and Delilah found themselves alone again on their porch, the mountains silhouetted against a star-filled sky. "Do you have any regrets?" Delilah asked quietly. Josiah considered the question seriously, as he always did. "I regret that I could not save my sister. I regret that your father put you in that situation. But I do not regret a single moment of our life together. Every joy, every hardship, every challenge, it all brought us here. And here is exactly where I want to be." "Me too," she agreed. "Though I hope we have many more years ahead of us, I am not ready to be done yet. Neither am I. I plan on growing old and gray with you, watching our grandchildren grow up, maybe even meeting great-grandchildren someday. We have a lot of living left to do." And they did. They had 10 more beautiful years together, filled with all the richness that a life well lived can offer. They traveled to San Francisco one summer and marveled at the ocean. They spent winters teaching their grandchildren to make snow angels and spring mornings planting gardens. They faced losses, friends who passed away, children who moved far from home, the inevitable aches and pains of aging bodies. But they faced it all together, their love a constant anchor in an ever-changing world. When Josiah finally passed away at the age of 73, it was peacefully in his sleep with Delilah beside him. She woke at dawn to find him still, his face relaxed and peaceful, his hand still holding hers. The grief was crushing, but even through her tears she felt grateful. They had been given more time than most couples ever got, and they had used every moment of it well. She buried him on a hillside overlooking the cabin, beneath a towering pine tree where he had always loved to sit and think. Their children and grandchildren came from across the territory to pay their respects, and the service was a celebration of a life well lived. Everyone shared stories of Josiah's kindness, his strength, his dry humor, and his absolute devotion to his family. Delilah stayed in the cabin, cared for by her children who took turns visiting, and making sure she was never alone for long. She filled her days with the things Josiah had loved, reading his favorite books, walking the trails they'd explored together, sitting on the porch and watching the mountains change with the seasons. She wore his old leather vest sometimes because it still smelled like him, and she talked to him as if he was still there beside her. 5 years later, at the age of 72, Delilah passed away in the same bed where she had slept beside Josiah for 35 years. Her children were with her, holding her hands and singing the songs she had taught them. Her last words were, "Tell your father I am coming home." They buried her beside Josiah on that hillside beneath the pine tree, and the entire community turned out to honor the woman who had been the heart of their family. On her headstone, beneath her name and dates, her children had carved a simple phrase, "She chose love." The cabin remained in the family for generations. James's children lived there, and then their children after that. It was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original structure remained: those thick log walls that had sheltered a mountain man and the woman he saved, the fireplace where they had fallen in love, the porch where they had watched countless sunsets together. And on that hillside, beneath the towering pine, 2 graves sat side by side, monuments to a love that had started with a choice and had lasted a lifetime. Visitors who knew the story would sometimes leave wildflowers there, touched by the tale of the mountain man who paid a debt to give a woman her freedom, and the woman who chose to give him her heart. It was a story told and retold through the generations, becoming part of the family's legacy. The story of how Josiah Walker had walked into a saloon on an October night in 1878 and changed the course of 2 lives forever. The story of how Delilah Jensen had been brave enough to trust a stranger, to choose hope over despair, to build a life in the wilderness with a man who proved every day that he was worthy of her trust. But more than anything, it was a love story, a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of choice, and the enduring strength of 2 people who committed to facing life together. It was proof that love could grow even in the harshest conditions, that families could be built on foundations of respect and partnership, and that sometimes the most important thing you could give someone was the freedom to choose their own path. In the end, that was what made their story special. Not that Josiah had saved Delilah from a terrible fate, though he had. Not that they had built a successful homestead or raised 4 wonderful children, though they did. What made their story special was that from the very beginning it had been built on choice. Josiah had chosen to help. Delilah had chosen to trust. And every day after that, they had chosen each other through good times and bad, through challenges and celebrations, through decades of life that brought both joy and sorrow. They had chosen love, and love had given them everything. The mountain stood eternal witness to their story, its peaks forever dusted with snow, its forests forever whispering with wind. And if you visited that hillside on a quiet evening when the sun was setting and the world was painted gold and pink, you might almost hear it, the echo of laughter, the murmur of voices sharing a private joke, the sound of 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and had refused to let go. That was the legacy of Josiah and Delilah Walker. Not wealth or fame or grand achievements, but something far more valuable, a love story that reminded everyone who heard it that even in the darkest moments, hope could be found, that kindness could change lives, that the right choice made at the right moment could lead to a lifetime of happiness. And so their story lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder that true love was not about possession or obligation, but about choice. The choice to see someone's worth. The choice to offer help without expecting anything in return. The choice to trust when trust was hard. The choice to build a life together, one day at a time, with patience and dedication and unwavering commitment. In the wild mountains of New Mexico, where the air was thin and clean and the stars shone with impossible brightness, their story became legend. the mountain man who paid a debt and asked for nothing, the woman who chose freedom and found love. Together, they had created something beautiful, a family, a legacy, and a love that would never be forgotten.